All right, I'm Pat. I am the co-founder of Madefor, and welcome to Basecamp. Excited to see our members here today and to see some new faces as well. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Today, we have the benefit of welcoming Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's a close friend of mine, our lead advisor at Madefor, and probably maybe the world's favorite neuroscientist these days as the host of the Huberman Lab. So welcome, Andrew. Excited to have you here.
Thanks. Delighted to be here. Sorry for the delay. That was my fault. I've got a neurosurgeon in the house today, and we had overlapping Wi-Fi, but it's working now.
Awesome. All right. Well, all good. So we'll get going. We'll talk for probably 45 minutes or so, and then if you have any questions, just throw them up in the chat, and then we'll get to the questions there at the end. But this is great. You know, when Andrew and I were talking about this Basecamp, one of the themes that came up is this idea of new year, new you. And we're all familiar with New Year's resolutions and the fresh start in the new year and all the benefits that can come from that. But we're also all probably familiar with what it means to fall short on a New Year's resolution or to jump ship on a resolution just after a few weeks. And so we thought it might be fun to spend this time together today to talk about how we might set ourselves up for success in the new year. And I think something that was really interesting that came out of our discussions, Andrew, was you said there's really two sides of this equation, or two parts. And oftentimes we focus on like, what's new? What are we going to go after next? And, but we ignore the first part. And you said that the two parts really are this idea of letting go. And then the second part is grabbing hold. And maybe we don't spend enough time on the letting go side of the equation. So I'd love to, maybe if you could share a little bit about what you're thinking there, and we'll use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah. So as people may have heard me say before, but if you haven't, it's fine. You know, we really have reflexive thoughts and action patterns, and then we have deliberate thoughts and action patterns. And most of the time when people are talking about transitioning or attempting to create some new behavior, it's necessary to think about behaviors and thought patterns as well that are preventing us from moving forward in the way we would like. So I think without knowing everybody's individual circumstances, of course, it's reasonable to assume that there are certain things that we know are barriers to forward progress. So some of those might include procrastination. Some are more energetic, in the sense that they are about lack of energy or lack of rest. The other side of the coin from lack of energy is too much running around and not enough rest. And so when we think about how we can create behavioral change, I think dividing this process into two parts: one about purging the reflexive thoughts and action patterns that we seem stuck with is its own form of what we call neuroplasticity, the brain and nervous system's capacity to change in response to experience. So that's one form, is unlearning, or sort of undoing the knot that seems built into our nervous system that we can't seem to relieve without some deliberate work. And then the other side of the coin, of course, is replacing those behaviors or adding in new behaviors and thought patterns. And that's also qualifies as neuroplasticity, changing your nervous system, but it actually requires a different form of neuroplasticity. So when we talk about unlearning or preventing reflexive thoughts and behaviors of our choice, what we're talking about is it's a process in the nervous system called long-term depression. It doesn't have to do with psychological depression. It's kind of unfortunate that the name is what it is, because we hear the word depression and we immediately go to this idea of sadness and depression. But long-term depression is actually a specific form of neuroplasticity where neurons are normally, that when one fires, the other one fires. You've heard fire together, wire together. Well, normally neurons are communicating in some very robust way. That's actually the basis of any reflex. So your ability to do something very easily and without much forethought is the one way of describing a reflex. And reflexes are very robust because the connections, the synapses between neurons that underlie them are very robust. They're what we call very reliable. And in order to make those connections less reliable, we have to create a process called long-term depression. And the way that one does that is actually very well scripted. And we'll learn some techniques today to create this, what we call long-term depression. Again, it's not psychological depression. What you're trying to do is reduce the probability that when neuron A sends a chemical signal, that neuron B will respond to that signal. So you're trying to uncouple the reflex. So that's the unlearning process, or the letting go process. There are a couple components to this process. The first one is that there has to be a clear and conscious understanding of what it is that you're trying to let go of. So if you don't have to write anything down, but if you are of the sort that likes to write things down, you want to write down that you have to have a very clear and conscious understanding of what exactly you are trying to let go of. Because one thing about reflexes is that one of the reasons that they are challenging to dismantle at a neurobiological level is because they are not super precise, right? It's like if you're somebody who, let's say, I'll use myself as an example. Let's say that I were to be a procrastinator about one thing. There's a good chance that procrastination circuit, if you will, carries over to a lot of other things. The generalizability of a lot of behaviors and thought patterns is wonderful when it serves us, but is terrible when it doesn't serve us. And so we have to be very precise in the way that we identify what it is that we're trying to change and actively work to unwire that specific set of neural circuits. So the first step in doing that is to have a very clear understanding of exactly what it is that we are trying to undo. So it can't be, for instance, let me give you an example of something rather general, which would be, for instance, in 2021, I was too busy. I want to be less busy, or I want to be less rushed, or I want to be less stressed, or I want to be less whatevered. It can't be a general state. It actually has to relate to specific behaviors or specific thought patterns. And the more clearly one can identify and articulate those in writing or in speech, the more likely it is that you'll be able to unwire them through the process called long-term depression. And I'll talk more about long-term depression in a moment. So that's the kind of neurobiological backdrop to this letting go process.
And Andrew, question, I'm curious on I understand that the way that the neurons are firing and the reflexive nature of these thoughts or these patterns or these habits that we have, how they get encoded in the brain. But I'm curious. I know Baumeister talks a lot about this idea that the bad is stronger than the good. And so I would imagine that if we look over the last year, or even, over the course of our lives, the amount of challenges that we faced, or, maybe emotional high moments or emotional low moments, or just things that we've had to overcome, have in some ways been encoded in the reflexive manner that we show up. And so I wonder how you think about that in this and how that gets encoded. So again, this idea that bad signals stay with us longer and are implanted in us in a way, or ingrained in us in such a way that they're harder to let go of. And maybe all the reason why it's so important that we're taking time to figure out how to let go of these things. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And today's an appropriate day to ask that question. So a very close friend of mine since childhood, since we were 9, is a neurosurgeon. He's actually the chair of neurosurgery at UC San Francisco. He also runs a laboratory, and he's visiting. And we were, as we sometimes do, we will just talk about neuroscience. His name is Dr. Edward Chang. And we were talking about some of this. He's been doing a lot of surgeries recently in the clinic. I think he told me he did 20 plus surgeries in the last 2 weeks. So these are drilling in through the skull, removing a piece of skull, and doing surgeries to remove the foci, as we call them, of epileptic seizures, trying to identify what's causing the seizures, trying to not paralyze people in the process. So people are talking and moving as he's doing these experiments, remarkable experiments, incredible close margins for error, millimeters from paralyzing someone versus essentially removing their seizures or restoring function. Incredible. And I asked him, what happens when you start marching around in the brain, stimulating, looking for where the seizures originate? He said, what you find is a little bit depressing. What you find is that, depressing in the classic sense of the word. What he said is that most places that you stimulate, people have horrible experiences or unpleasant experiences. You'll stimulate one place and the person will say, that makes me feel anxious. You'll stimulate another place and the person will say, well, that makes me feel really nauseous. You'll stimulate a completely different location. People say, that makes me really fearful. You keep stimulating, and most of the brain areas, it turns out, are responsible for feelings that are not great or even quite bad or even awful. This is the way we are built. Certain areas, when you stimulate them, people say, oh, that feels kind of pleasant, or that kind of gives me a tickling or a happy sensation, or evokes a sense of awe. But those sites at which stimulation of the brain can evoke positive sensations, thoughts, and actions are exceedingly rare. And I thought, wow, this is really depressing. We're basically wired to be unhappy. And that's not really the way it is. We actually just have a lot more brain real estate designed to keep us safe and from avoiding things like cliffs and bad experiences. And, the world is not necessarily filled with danger, but the world is filled with a lot of things that we would be better off avoiding, and perhaps people we would be better off avoiding too. And so this is the way we are wired. It does not mean that we are biased to be unhappy. It just means that there's a lot more brain real estate that is devoted to this, to these negative sensations. And that's the reality. And I'm not going to tell you different. And he's the neurosurgeon, and he's not going to tell us different either. Now, the interesting thing about these brain areas is that, and what I'm about to tell you is that it's going to get a little more depressing before it gets better. The way it's going to get a little depressing is that not only are these brain areas far outnumbering the number of brain areas that lead to positive sensations and feelings of well-being, but they also are able to become stronger much more easily in what we call one trial learning. If you have the unfortunate experience of eating a particular food and then getting sick, chances are you will avoid that food forever unless you really encourage yourself to overcome that particular food type, even though it might have had nothing to do with that particular food. Could have been the restaurant, could have been something unfortunate about your state at the time. Maybe you were carrying a bug from something else. Doesn't matter. The brain is a learning machine, and its primary goal is to keep us safe. So, and these synapses, these connections actually form very easily and are very hard to undo. Now, that all sounds depressing. It's sort of like a double whammy. But the good news is that the process of long-term depression, this progressive weakening or deliberate weakening of connections, is also very robust, provided that it's deployed in the correct ways. And the other thing that is really special about humans, at least we believe humans and not other species, although we don't know if it's true in other species, is that this ability to consciously recognize things is not just about creating intentions, which are fine, and it's not just about being able to articulate something very specifically, but that the seat of our higher consciousness, which is this forebrain area we call the prefrontal cortex, has an even more powerful control over these other brain areas. And that even more powerful control is a process that we call inhibition. There are connections in the nervous system that we call excitatory, in which one neuron releases a chemical that stimulates the electrical activity of the next neuron. So it's excitatory, kind of like a domino falling. One domino falls, the next one falls. However, there are certain neurons in our nervous system that release particular kinds of chemicals called GABA and glycine and things of that sort that are inhibitory, meaning when they fire electrical action potentials, they release a chemical, and that particular chemical prevents the next neuron from firing. So there's a stop signal that can also be deployed. And in the human nervous system, one of the more powerful stop signals is the one that comes from our conscious thought, and from this area that the reason I'm touching my forehead is that resides right behind our forehead, which is the prefrontal cortex. So much so that our subjective experience or our subjective interpretation of experience can take what seem to be very hardwired reflexes and give them a completely different meaning and outcome. One of my favorite examples of this is if you take a human or an animal and you give it the opportunity to exercise. Some will, some won't, some to enjoy exercise more than others. But let's say that you take two human beings or two mice or two rats or whatever it is, and you tether them such that every time, let's say Pat runs on a treadmill, I'm forced to run on a treadmill. Let's say we live on these treadmills, and these experiments have been done. We know that there are positive effects on the physiology of the body and brain from cardiovascular exercise. So Pat, running on his treadmill in this thought experiment, is going to experience reductions in blood pressure over time, reductions in cortisol, if he's choosing to run on that treadmill. If I'm being forced to run on that treadmill, well, then I'm going to have the exact opposite effects. What's Pat's forcing me to run on my treadmill by his running is actually going to create increased blood pressure, increased cortisol, stress hormone in my bloodstream, and overall is going to stress my system. So it's the exact same stimulus, the exact same behavior, But if my interpretation is that someone is imposing it on me, it has a completely different effect. Now, there's a remedy to this, and this experiment has also been done, whereby Pat runs on, figuratively speaking, Pat runs on his treadmill. I'm running on mine and I'm forced to, but I'm told that exercise is good for me, okay? And that it's going to lead to positive outcomes. And I believe those things. And I believe them because they actually happen to be true. You could show me data, or you could take at face value. And now, even though I'm being forced to do it, I derive all the same benefits that he does from the same activity. Now, that's a somewhat extensive example, but the point is this, that our subjective interpretation of any experience actually dictates whether or not that experience has positive or negative effects on our system. Now, of course, there are limits to this. I can't tell myself, for instance, that cutting off a digit on my hand is going to be good for me, because it's not. There's just no way in which I can imagine that it would be. But within the bounds of normal behaviors, or within the bounds of behavior and thought patterns, how our conscious interpretation of what's happening to us has a tremendous effect on not just the scale of a response, that how much blood pressure changed, but actually the direction of that response. So in thinking about unlearning, we really derive tremendous power from not just deciding what we want to change explicitly. That was kind of the first thing that we spelled out, but also thinking about why we want to do that and the positive effects of doing that. And notice I haven't yet said that we will replace that behavior with any other particular behavior, or replace that thought pattern with any other particular thought pattern. But the subjective interpretation is not a trivial point. It's not that we can will an experience to be good for us when it's not. It's all about what we truly believe. So if there's something that you think is not serving you well and you need to let go of, that is a great thing to hold on to. And then once you've held on to that, you want to articulate exactly what it is that you want to let go of in terms of thought or behavior. And then once you've grabbed hold of that, you want to ratchet a little bit deeper and think about what will be the positive effects, psychological, emotional, physical, or otherwise, that you will derive from letting go of that particular behavior or thought pattern. And that third step is absolutely key, because it actually dictates the fact that the letting go will indeed have a positive effect on your physiology, will indeed have a positive effect on your psychology. This has been shown numerous times for different types of examples. So our subjective interpretation is not just psychological, it's actually neurophysiological, because of these inhibitory connections from the forebrain, from the prefrontal cortex, that allow certain types of physiological responses to emerge and others to be suppressed.
Mm-hmm. So, Andrew, so subjectively, if we've had negative experiences or we have negative patterns and we decide that they're not serving us well, there's the protocol that you just kind of talked us through about how to isolate and dig a little bit deeper on what's going on there and how you can truly let those go. But I think probably for some, and certainly for myself, even just looking back to say, all right, hey, what's not working, or identifying what these challenges are for us, whether it's the past year or the past couple of years, can be a really hard thing. And it brings to mind something that one of our mutual friends, Dr. Preston Klein and Coleman Ruiz, talk about. And this really relates to combat operators. They have this term called combat residue. And the idea is that over time, through deployment after deployment, maybe you have highs or you have lows on deployments, but over time, your experience leaves a residue on you. And that left unaddressed, that is going to impart a cost on you at some point, that you're going to get more rigid, you're going to get more locked in, and ultimately it's going to cause really big problems. And so I thought it was interesting because, we're obviously not all in combat all the time, but we're all facing challenges. We're all facing stresses. We all have things that we fall short on, or if you're like me, you probably fall short more often than you care to admit. But I think it is really important that we state how important it is to this process of reflection. And I can say, to bring another military point to light, is that oftentimes after an operation, we'll do something called the hot wash, which is like an immediate after action review, where we'll bring the entire team together and we'll go gloves off, what went right, what went wrong. And it doesn't matter what your rank is. It doesn't matter, how senior you are or anything. Everyone is fair game. And it's through this process that we get better. And the only thing that unifies everyone in that room, sometimes it can get really heated and emotional, but the thing that unifies everyone in this is this desire to be better. And I think ultimately that's all any of us want, right? It doesn't matter what we're facing or what we think we're going to face or what we want for our future, but ideally we want to be better. And so I think it's why this part of this process of letting go and the steps that Andrew has laid out is just so important, that you take some time to do it. Because if you skip this step and you just focus on what do I want next year, very quickly, because of the reflexive nature of how we are designed and how we've been wired, we're going to fall back into our old patterns and old habits. So just a thought there, Andrew, but curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that and I noticed that a few people are starting to ask questions about, and I realize we will get to questions later about, some concrete examples. A good example would be, let's say you're somebody who wakes up in the morning and has a habit of looking at your phone and scrolling. This is something that we're all guilty of. And I do say guilty because there does seem to be real, genuine value to what I call getting the download, paying some attention to some of the subconscious processing that occurred throughout the night and grabbing a hold of some of the new learned knowledge, because of course in sleep is when neuroplasticity occurs. Also benefits, of course, to getting outside and getting sunlight in the first 30 to 60 minutes of the day. Number of things that you're just not doing when you're lying in bed and scrolling the phone. Something that I often am accused around here in my household of doing too much. And indeed, I think they're right. I think that it's important that we get into forward action that serves us. And while there are examples of the phone providing that forward action, it's more often than not the case. So a good example would be deciding, okay, I want to stop doing that. Now, that's a clear articulation of the exact behavior you want to create. So that was the first step. But I think it's actually worthwhile. The brain loves story and the brain loves detail when it comes to these kinds of things. And so adding a more specificity is even better. So I might say, I would like to stop picking up my phone, looking at my phone and wasting so much time on there. In fact, let's be more precise. And I could say any more than 60 seconds spent looking at my phone first thing in the morning is actually starting to erode my conscious behavior and decision-making in ways that are not good for me. Okay, let's drill a little bit further, right? You can see how this exercise is going. It'd be listing off the reasons. One is it's not providing the amount or the quality or the amount of bright light that I need at that particular hour. And that could serve me well. So it's a kind of a double whammy. Second, it's unpredictable what information is going to be on there: text message, email, social media. So I'm not in control of my sensory experience. I'm giving up control. And then let's just add another one. Third, chances are I'm going to struggle with putting it down after 60 seconds. So I'm just coming up with this example off the top of my head now, but it's not, I'm going to stop doing this and that's it. I'm fleshing out that specific example with more and more specificity about exactly what it is that's a problem and exactly what it is that I would like to avoid or relieve. So hopefully that's clear to people. And that example could be given to anything. Notice we haven't talked at all about what the replacement behavior would be. Now, in giving a lot of detail to something, what you're really doing is you, in a kind of neurobiological framework, you're starting to ratchet into the underlying process, right? And in being able to articulate it out loud or writing it out, even better would be to write it out on a piece of paper. And even better than that would be to write it out on a piece of paper and actually read it to somebody that you trust or to yourself, right? But in doing that, you're creating a very vivid picture of exactly what the behavior is that you want to modify. Now, this runs counter to a lot of the literature and data and arguments out there that you'll hear about behavioral modification, in which they say that you don't want to make it too specific, because then you'll have all these alternate routes by which you could work around. You could say, listen, I don't want to look at it for any more than 60 seconds, but I didn't say that I didn't want to look at it for 30 minutes, right? You start negotiating like a small child with yourself. We all do this. It's like, I actually see this a lot in online behavior, and I can laugh at myself about this too, because you'll oftentimes, for example, the human brain will say something like, this particular food is good. Let's just use an innocuous example. Pomegranates are really good for us. And people say, well, yeah, but are you saying that cantaloupes are bad for us? And I'm like, no, I don't think that was part of the conversation. I'm pretty sure we were just talking about the pomegranates. But there's something about the way the human brain works is when we hear something that seems very categorical, we tend to respond with, well, but wait, does that also, are you also saying blank, blank, and blank? Actually, a lot of online confusion and battles are about this misunderstanding about our nature. So what I've done in this kind of trivial example, but about the phone use, but I do think actually for some of us, it's a real problem, is to give a specific behavior and then ratchet into the specific aspects of that behavior that create specific problems, right? And in doing that, you're really giving, for lack of a better word, forgive me for saying it so much, but you're giving specificity to the precise neural circuitry that you wish to eliminate, that you wish to weaken. Okay. And that's vitally important because it doesn't work to simply say, I want to do something else more. Then people will say, well, how many times are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? How are you going to schedule it? That's one version of this. Here we're talking about the mirror image of that, where you're trying to unlearn something in a very robust way. So the more specificity, the more detail, the more you can write it out, the more you can speak it, and ideally write it out and speak it. I can't guarantee that you'll be able to make this change, but you do stand a much higher probability of being able to make the change quickly and stick to that. And that's supported by so I guess we would call this behavioral psychology literature, behavioral change literature.
Andrew, I'm curious your thoughts on this. When I think about looking back to identify what is the pattern or the habit that I want to change, oftentimes I kind of fall into this trap of, oh, there's 2 or 3 things, or there's 4 or 5 things, and I want to try to address all of these things. And I think my thinking on this has evolved over time to where now I'm always looking for what is that keystone habit or that keystone pattern, or the thing that's almost the root cause, and the downstream effect of that thing is maybe I'm checking my phone incessantly, or I'm not present with my children, or I'm not, I'm quick to jettison a new routine. So I always try to pull the thread till I get to the root cause and say, okay, this is the thing that I actually want to change. And then I spend time doing exactly what we were talking about, of figuring out, how is this impacting my ability to move closer to the things I care about, and getting real specific on what is the aversion to this particular aspect of who I am, or reflexively how I'm showing up. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that one of the key things to identify is that most of the time, the things that we wish to change that we haven't, or that have carried over for some time, are not creating enough pain, and therefore that's why we're able to maintain them, right? Sadly, this is the other dark and unfortunate aspect of our wiring, which is that unless there are consequences, we oftentimes won't change behaviors now and thought patterns. Now, one of the more important things here, two important points related to that, is that it's important to not artificially amplify what something means, right? The fact that let's stay with the example, looking at one's phone first thing in the morning for too long, it is amazing how much time can go by, right? And how much you can do in that time, and where you accomplish essentially nothing on the phone. It's like mental chewing gum. You're just kind of going around and around and around. You're not really accomplishing anything. And I do believe in the utility of social media and phones and things of that sort too. So there's a place for it. But it is remarkable how much life, energy, and time we can waste. So that I think in this example that we set up for sake of example, I think that there is this, the problem is, part of it is that it's not enough of a problem, right? And one way that you can make it more of a problem is to pretend you could try and artificially amplify that, oh, this is depleting my work, this is depleting my relationships, it's all so bad. If it were really so bad, you probably would have stopped, right? If it were really that bad, you would be able to intervene. So I think that the important thing is to really create specificity as we talked about before. And in that, you you start to reveal the full extent of the problem, right? You start to really reveal it in the language around, I've spent a lot of time around trauma release and addiction centers. I've been working on this book for a number of years. I spent a lot of time there, and I have a colleague, he's a friend of Pat and I are, his name is Ryan Swab. He does remarkable work with lots of different groups of people. He's in private practice, but does incredible work. And he has this phrase, which I like, that points to this, which is that the subtle informs the gross. It's the subtle things over time that eventually lead to, going way outside the lane lines for people. And that's not just related to addiction, but for all sorts of thought patterns included. But it's because it's subtle that we don't notice. Now, it's also important that we not get into modes of, self-denigration and shame around these things. That kind of gets back to your earlier example, these kind of putting yourself in the cooker after a bad performance or experience. We have to maintain that stance of being realistic, but not flagellating ourselves to the point of tissue damage, psychologically speaking. So I think that the key is to add specificity, because in adding that specificity, we get to a very realistic lens or view on just how bad this really is without artificially amplifying it. And I don't think artificial amplification works, because one thing that the nervous system is really good at is knowing when we're lying to ourselves. It's incredibly good at it. It doesn't mean we change our behavior. That's also true. But it's not sufficient to just decide this is really bad. It's costing me. If it were costing you would have changed it in 2020. Or I would have changed. Let's use me as the bad actor here, because I in some ways I'm probably talking about myself. It would have changed in 2020. So I think that you don't want to make it characterological. I can never say that word. Characterological. And you'll sometimes hear sayings within the trauma release community, like things like guilt is something you feel, shame is about who you are. I don't know that I really believe that these kind of semantic phrases really work. I think you can have shame about something that you did. I think you have guilt about something you did. I think you have guilt about who you are. I think you have so I don't really like those kind of phraseology type things. I think that we just have to be exceedingly realistic about what's happening. We have to acknowledge in a gentle way and in a fair way that once these reflexes are wired in, they are just reflexes. Let's face it, many of us go see others, no one's looking at their phone, someone picks up their phone, and all of a sudden everyone does it. And I don't even think people make a conscious choice. I think it's become a fixed action pattern, much like animals have fixed action patterns. So I think that we want to acknowledge, however, that it is interfering, whatever behavior or thought pattern is interfering with the opportunity to carry out other more, let's call them adaptive thought patterns and behaviors. So specificity. I don't think you can add enough detail to it. I don't think you need to artificially amplify the severity of it in order to change it. In fact, I think if you do that and you start lying to yourself about it, I think you take this down the wrong road. And you also stand the chance of getting into that, self-flagellation mode that is not healthy.
Mm-hmm. Very, very wise. I think just one final thought on this, and then we'll maybe flip to the other side of the equation. But I think don't miss the opportunity to look at something big. And so if something is not making a meaningful impact on you, then maybe it's not worth the time. But if you can look at, again, going back to a central issue or a keystone pattern, something that has really forced you to maybe move away from the things that you care most about, that might be a great thing to focus on. And I think whatever issue you're talking about, I think we have to recognize that we bias the immediate over the long term. And so whether we might see that the effects of something in the short run aren't that bad, maybe looking at my phone every day or spending a lot of time on my phone doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, but maybe over the long term, it means that I'm actually less present with my children and I'm not as connected as I could be with those that I care most about. So I think being able to toggle between immediate effects and long-term effects and playing that out over time is only going to help inform what you do and what makes sense for you. So I think that's an important point. Andrew, when we were talking about this idea of letting go and grabbing hold, you raised a really interesting point. You said, so oftentimes we fall into this line of thinking that these behaviors or these patterns are two sides to one coin. And so on one side is the right way, on the other side is the wrong way. And it's an all or nothing kind of mindset when it comes to a pattern. But what you were saying is that actually these fall on a spectrum or a path. And so it's maybe not in our interest to think of these as, binary options, but rather it's more of a spectrum. And in doing so, that provides some opportunity for us to nudge our behaviors or our patterns in a better direction. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and this brings us, probably the word of the day is specificity, but for me anyway, which is, for instance, in the phone example, I mean, well, for instance, as many of you know, I have a podcast that comes out every Monday morning. I'm not advertising it, but what I am going to tell you is that every Monday morning, I'm up very, very early posting assets for the podcast, on Twitter and Instagram. And so that's the time when I need to be on my phone, where I absolutely have to violate my own rule in order to do something that's functional for me. So this is where specificity is really valuable, because if I'm specific about not going on there unless it's for a specific purpose or for something related to the lab or business or something of that sort, well, then I can have the kind of flexibility where I don't have to worry that by simply engaging in that behavior that it's going to wick out to the whole week, where on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, I'm doing the exact same thing. Okay, so I will say it again and again. I cannot overemphasize the importance of specificity when it comes to this, because in specificity, we also gain the confidence, A, that we are tackling the right thing, B, that, and I should put a point on below that, which is that sometimes in doing that exercise of drilling into something, you realize that you actually don't want to change it, but not because you should and you don't want to, but you're like, wait a second, this is actually serving me well in some way. I think that's the rarer circumstance, but it can happen, right? And Pat and I will bring this around to, how you select the thing. And I think it really should be one thing, ideally, to really focus on primarily, at least at a time. So that's the first thing, is specificity allows you flexibility, right? Where you can maintain certain aspects of this given behavior or thought pattern under the right circumstances, and you define those circumstances. And then the second thing is that as you, as I called it, drill deeper into exactly what it is that you're trying to change, you actually are already starting the process. This is one of the kind of cool features of these long-term depression type synaptic mechanisms, that by identifying exactly what it is that you want to uncouple, the checking of your phone or the picking up of your phone at a particular time of day, as it relates to the fact that you're not getting the correct quality of light, you're open to sensory input from the outside world that is sometimes of kind of unfortunate. Like, I don't want my mornings to be random. I've worked very hard to not let all but a few people and circumstances influence me early in the day, because that's crucial time for me. So creating these barriers is important, because if I look at the phone, anything can come in, other people's stresses, other people's anxiety, other people's whatevers that are that for me are maladaptively distracting. So again, with specificity comes flexibility. With specificity comes increased confidence that you're going to make those changes. And finally, with increased specificity, you are already initiating the process of undoing these behaviors.
Awesome. You said something the other night. You said the brain does not delete, it overwrites, and that it takes time to change old patterns and adopt new reflexive ways of being. And you went on to say that the power of a written intention, you said that the moment you acknowledge something in writing, it becomes an undeniable truth that you can work with. Your brain starts to formulate a plan automatically as it organizes and orients the subconscious mind. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit for people?
Yes. So the brain definitely doesn't delete, it overrides. I mean, there are classic experiments now to support this. For example, a kind of dramatic example, but there are a lot of these in the literature. If someone has we're geeky scientists around here, so we call them digits. But if it has a finger amputated, or if you have a limb that's you can't use because it's casted up, the brain real estate that represents that finger or that limb doesn't simply sit there idling until the limb is used again. Actually, the brain areas that sit adjacent to it and that represent the neighboring portions of the body, like the shoulder and the torso, actually start to invade into that territory in your cortex in the brain. And the consequence of that is actually that you have improved sensitivity of those neighboring areas. You actually can even get improved function of other areas. There are other dramatic examples of this. People made blind or congenitally blind, a terrible situation, obviously, but their so-called visual cortex then becomes allocated for braille reading and for hearing, and they become super sensitive, in the good sense of the word, to auditory cues and to touch cues. All right. So they're better at hearing and touch than anyone else is who's sighted, because that real estate is taken over. In a similar way, the neuroplasticity that underlies unlearning and benefits greatly from replacement or invasion of that now quiet territory in the brain with inputs that are reflective of another ideally positive type behavior. Okay. And for anyone that's ever spent time, again, I mean, I can be full disclosure. As I mentioned before, I'm fortunate that I don't have a penchant for drugs or alcohol. It's just not my wiring to like those things, but I've spent a lot of time in the addiction community learning about the practices as they relate to neuroplasticity. And there you see this in very robust form as people are starting to change their behaviors and eliminate what are for them very maladaptive behaviors. They are always encouraged to replace those behaviors with something that's adaptive. They're never told to just not do something. They're told to do something else instead. And they go through a variety of different options. And a big part of that process is learning which behaviors, and when context changes and people are far from home, how to find other accessible behaviors, and so forth. And that's kind of an extreme example, but the process of becoming, of going from addicted to sober is not just one of eliminating brain circuitry, it's of repurposing that same brain circuitry for other things. And that whole business of repurposing is neuroplasticity, the nervous system's capacity to change in response to experience. And so again, that's a two-part process. You have to have long-term depression, again, not psychological depression, but what we call synaptic depression. And then you have to have long-term potentiation, which is the increase in the strength of given connections serving other types of thoughts or behaviors. And so that's when we start to think about unlearning. Is you just can't leave that real estate sitting empty, or there's a tendency for the unwanted thought or behavior to reemerge again, and quite easily, because if you think about it, it's been there a long time, or it's simply working very robustly, and so it's hard to undo. So you have to replace these the function of these circuits with new adaptive functions. So that's I think where we're headed now with the sort of the learning or the adopting of new positive habits, thoughts, and behaviors.
And so Andrew, once you identify the thoughts, patterns, and behavior that you want to adopt, or that on the spectrum are going to bring you closer to ultimately to where you want to be, or closer to the things you care most about. I think it's interesting. Katie Milkman out of Penn talks about this idea of the fresh start effect, that oftentimes things like a new year, these temporal landmarks can serve as a really great opportunity to almost have a fresh start, where we feel like, all right, we get to reset. We're starting on solid ground, and score is 0-0. Let's begin again and try again. I think what's interesting here is that these temporal landmarks, they don't just have to be at the end of the year. And what the research has shown is they're really great at helping us form new positive behaviors and to reset if we're coming out of a challenging year or a challenging circumstance. But these temporal resets are not great if we're actually doing well. And so I saw a few folks say that, hey, I can't identify a negative habit or a negative pattern. What should I do? If you're feeling good and you're having positive momentum, you might not need to do anything. But if you do feel like, hey, this is something that I want to adapt, I want to let go of this thing, I want to grab a hold of this thing. New Year is a great time for that. But then this idea that these temporal landmarks can exist, and I would imagine something that you'll talk about, Andrew, in that could be every week where you're checking back in with, how am I doing? Am I directionally in line with the new pattern that I want to adopt, or the new behavior that I want to do? And almost using these reset points as a way to help us get back on track if we've fallen off course. Any thoughts there, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think temporal landmarks and milestones are really key. I mean, that they're both powerful, and they can also be somewhat of a mirage. And I think it's important to acknowledge this. I mean, there does seem to be something kind of magical about a new year, kind of new year, new you. And we tend to use birthdays as well. I don't want to spin off into a long discussion about time perception, but it's an area I'm kind of obsessed with and have been for a long time. I mean, there are good data now to support the fact that the way that we parse time is neurochemical to some extent. There's a beautiful paper published this last year in the journal Neuron, which is a terrific journal, having people watch a sports game and it was a basketball game, while their brains were being imaged, and they knew the favorite team of the given subject in the experiment. They knew what the sort of expectation of outcome was. The person had the people in the study had a lot of knowledge about who was likely to score or not score, given who was holding the ball and the configuration. So these are pretty detailed experiments. But what they essentially found, and the takeaway, is that the small pulses, not enormous pulses, but small pulses of the release of the neuromodulator dopamine actually reset people's perception of time. And they had a brilliant way of analyzing this by how well they were keeping track of overall time versus kind of local time of a drive down court. So in any case, it makes sense that we would have these temporal landmarks, right? A birthday typically has a certain celebration. We've all had downer birthdays and better birthdays, but New Year's the idea is that, that it's a celebration of sorts that we're marking the passage. Obviously, we all know what New Year's is, marking the passage of another cycle around the sun. But it is thought that the celebration and the dopamine associated with celebration does create a kind of neurobiological temporal landmark that we really can think of it as everything of past and everything of future as not just in 2021 versus in 2022, but prior to that dopamine release and post that dopamine release. Interesting stuff, actually, when you think about it, the conversion of an external cue about time and the milestone in time to an internal biological cue. Because of course, neurons don't know anything about years or dates. They only know chemicals and electrical signals. That's the currency and those are the vowels and syllables, excuse me. Those are the vowels and syllables of the nervous system. So I think that when we think about temporal cues, we don't want to delude ourselves. We don't want to think that something magical happens on January 1. On the other hand, there does seem to be a real neurobiological substrate marking the passage of time, in this case, dopamine, and a very particular style of dopamine release at that. So I think that the important thing in adopting these positive behaviors is it really does make sense that you in a very detailed and concrete way, that you identify that this time is different than the previous time, meaning previous epoch. I always want to use these scientific words. That's not something we hear, but the previous epoch, it is the appropriate word, but the previous sort of bin of time, that you could say 2021 or even December 2021. But how finely we parse time is also going to predict the likelihood that we're going to be able to initiate and maintain behavioral change. And this is where I think Pat and I, in preparing for this, really converged to a strong degree. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that was my sense, which is that there's absolutely no reason why these behavioral changes have to be approached from the standpoint of all of 2021. That's the hope. But maybe we could lend ourselves a favor by taking smaller time bins and trying to embark on behavioral change within smaller time bins. Pat talked about this before, and I've really adopted a lot of the language and thinking around this notion of moving the horizon. This is something that he described as one of the many ways in which you move through SEAL team training and work in the SEAL teams, which is that under conditions of uncertainty and discomfort, but in particular uncertainty, what you try and do is create a circumstance in which everything is 100% certain or close to it. And so the way to do that is to move in the space horizon, meaning only try and affect things in the environment in which you can immediately act, and in the immediate temporal horizon, meaning within the time frame that you can, and then move that horizon out further and further. So what is the best time scale for these kind of behavioral changes that we're talking about? Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that you still need the kind of specificity that you applied for the unlearning for learning and adoption of new behaviors. You really do need to be precise about exactly what it is, when you're going to do it, what that's going to feel like, the positive effects that it's going to create. More specificity, more specificity, more specificity. Writing and speaking that writing out loud, ideally to someone else. Terrific. Some people like to set contingencies. I'm going to, give someone a $10,000 check that you really, really hate, that if you don't do the thing, or if you do the thing, or you're going to punish or reward yourself. We could get into reward and punishment schedules. That's yet another way to leverage these dopamine systems. But I don't think we want to necessarily rely on that. I think the better way, the more empowering way, if you will, is to realize that you have the capacity to set these plans, and that the more specific those plans are, the more likely are that you will embark on them. And the shorter the time window and space window, if you will, the closer the horizon, the more likely that you're going to be able to do those. So keeping with the previous example would be, okay, I'm going to just use one that I use all the time. I'm not going to look at the phone first thing in the morning. If I do, 60 seconds is going to be the absolute limit. And then at that point, it's what is the replacement behavior? And of course, the behavior you can imagine is going to be to access sunlight or artificial light if you can't access sunlight for 10 minutes at first thing in the morning. Something that sounds trivially easy actually, but it actually takes some willpower, especially I'm located in two places now, but it's been raining quite a bit where I'm living, and and it's the kind of thing where one finds themselves not doing these things often when they're really straightforward. So you want to get very, very specific. And for me, I would probably set that time bin on the time scale of 1 day. I want to nail January 1, right? Then I'll worry about January 2. Then I'll worry about January 3, right? But you could even move the time bin in closer. You can even just decide that it's going to be about that morning, right? And so there are a number of different ways to do this, but I think that trying to bite off the entire year in one behavior, massive adopting of a new behavior is the temptation, because we like the idea that we're going to do it for an entire year, but I think we bias the probability against it actually happening when we do that. Pat, I'm curious what sort of time scale you think would be necessary, but I do want to just make the one more point about this, which I think that the time bin should scale inversely with your sense or your probability that you will actually do it, right? So if it's a low probability, right? Or I should say, if there's a lot of resistance, it should probably be a short time scale. And if it's very little resistance, you could probably bite off the whole month or the year. Would you agree or disagree? And I'm always happy to be disagreed with.
I think I agree with that. I mean, I always come back to what's effective and what works for you, and recognizing that what works for Andrew on this call is going to be different than what works for Teresa or what works for Nadine. We're all going to have unique solutions, but much as you talk about self-directed adaptive plasticity, that we have the capacity to direct our brain change and by proxy change our mindset and our habits and our behaviors, we also have this capacity of self-directed horizon control, to steal some of Andrew's verbiage, so that we have the ability to move that finish line as close in as we need to, or as far out as we need to, in order to get us to do the behavior that we want to do. And I think the larger context of this conversation is really just creating awareness of what's serving us well, what isn't, and how can we move in a direction that serves us better. And I think, we can dive deep into the mechanistic nature of what's happening in the brain and the body. I think it's really important to do so. And that's why we do so. So you can have some conviction and certainty around what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, it's really, are you taking the opportunity to look back to see, hey, what is not working for me? Can you get really close to that and see why is it not working for me? And what is the cost associated with that? And to Andrew's point, really getting very specific, as much specificity as possible, so that you can use that as fuel for driving you in a better direction. And then on the flip side, it's going again to the other side of the spectrum of like, well, what is that thing that I want to replace that with? And what is the members that are on this will be very familiar to them, but what's the smallest step possible that I can take? And maybe that's on the time horizon of a day. Maybe it's half a day, maybe it's a morning, but what's that smallest step I can take in line with that direction? And then can I reward that? Can I repeat the process again and again and again? And also recognize that none of us are machines on this call. And I don't care if you're a Navy SEAL, I don't care if you're a neuroscientist, or if you're doesn't matter, a teacher, we all fall off track and we all fall short. And so the name of the game here is, can you be your own best teammate? Can you extend yourself grace and guide yourself back on track when you're ready? So that's my thought on that, Andrew. On your pithy question, I had a very long response, but that's
no, it's a great one. And I think that as you said that, I mean, I think that the other thing is that when you set the more horizons you set, the more work it seems like, but it's also the opportunity to derive more rewards. And I don't mean external rewards. I mean the reward of correct performance. If you make it about the whole thing, the whole month, the whole year, well, then the reward only becomes the whole month and the whole year. So you're actually kind of biasing the reward systems against you. Now, I know that this has other names and carries other forms. People talk about chunking, and people talk about habits and micro habits, and probably, there's probably micro habits now, and rituals and things of that sort. I think that all of that language works. I'm not trying to take away from any of that beautiful work, but the problem with just the mere notion of chunking or of habits is it overwrites, or it neglects rather, the fact that the reward schedule associated with habits varies depending on the number of habits you expect to execute before you'll consider it done, right? So this is the value of daily or even half-day checklists, right? Because you can really extract rewards rather than this idea, well, okay, I have to carry this new behavior out for an entire year. So it's not just about the overwhelm of trying to tackle big goals in all at once. It's also the lack of reward schedule that can reinforce those new behaviors. But when you move the horizon in close, you can start, it takes some work, but you can start to tap into literally the sensations that you're quote unquote winning. I can't think of a better word. You're winning against something that I've referred to before. It's not a scientific term formally, but this notion of limbic friction, that you've got these kind of reflexive circuits that want to drive you in one direction. And let's face it, it's a lot of work to kind of scruff yourself and reorient yourself and make you go do something else. If you've ever had small animals, there's an appropriate and humane way to scruff them. And humans oftentimes have to scruff ourselves, and it's something that we don't do very easily. And the reason is it takes work. It's neural work. It's not caloric work per se. It's neural energy. If you can kind of embrace that concept. So the more limbic friction, the more work it's going to take. That's kind of a duh, but the more limbic friction you're able to override in a short time scale, the more frequently that you can provide the rewards that make that kind of behavior eventually reflexive.
Andrew, we just have a couple minutes left, and I'm gonna put you on the spot. I'm gonna ask you about a prayer that you mentioned to me the other night. But before we get there, just so everyone is clear on the recap, can you talk through the specific protocol for letting go and grabbing hold in as few a word as possible?
Yeah, I'm not known for being succinct, and it's not about to start now, but I'll do my best. As I sometimes like to joke, and people around my household will confirm that if nothing else, I might cure insomnia, but not by way of an episode on sleep. So simply put, identify one, I did say one thought pattern or behavior that you wish to let go of from this current year. As you transition to the new year and beyond. Identify it with a very high degree of specificity, which does not just mean naming it, but also understanding the specific verbs associated with that behavior, right? I think verbs are really powerful as a means to bring specificity. So you're talking about picking it up, you're talking about looking at it, you're talking about scrolling. So a lot of verbs are good. Bring as much specificity to it, write it down, say it out loud, ideally to someone else. If you can't do it to someone else, then just write it down and say it out loud. If you wanted, you could place that in a prominent place. Some people do that. I don't happen to do that. If I did that, my home would be covered with sticky notes. My home is actually covered with a lot of sticky notes, but not about those sorts of things. Then the other thing is to keep in touch with that practice by understanding that the more specificity you bring to the letting go, which is essentially this long-term depression, that you can think about that particular behavior as a series of steps that you wish to undo. And again, that's bringing more specificity to the particular types of connections that you want to depress or uncouple. Then there's the learning, or remember that there is no deletion or absent brain space. It's all used. And so you need to replace that now quieted neural circuitry with a different behavior or thought pattern. Pick one, and I do mean one. It doesn't have to occur at the exact same time, although that would be great. In the example I gave before, it was the morning sunlight or bright light viewing. If you can't access sunlight for 10 minutes, just as by way of example. But if you're already doing that, great. There again, more specificity, set a time. The more specificity, the better. Write it down, articulate it to yourself, ideally to someone else. And in addition to that, you want to set the time bin. I think it's reasonable to try and accomplish this on January 1 and January 2. I kind of like 2-day time bins. I feel like if you do it on a day-to-day basis, there's always the probability or possibility rather, that you would do it one day and not the next. I kind of like doing 2 days at a time. That's it. For some reason, for me, that's very tractable. I don't know what it would be for any of you, but there are certain things that perhaps you wouldn't want to do 2 days in a row. But setting a time bin in which you are as close to certain as possible, or certain that you would be able to accomplish it in that time bin. Decide, I'm going to do this for 2 days. I'm going to do this for 2 days. I'm going to do this for 1 day. And it might even be shorter than that. And then there's the reinforcement of that over time. And we didn't really touch on this, but the reinforcement over time involves making sure that if it's becoming reflexive, that you don't take that reflex action for granted. I did see in the questions, and I get asked a lot, and I think Pat gets asked this a lot, is it true it takes 21 days to learn a new habit? Is it 6 days? Is it 67 days? It's going to scale with whether or not it's a positive or negative experience, and it's also going to scale with the intensity of that experience. So I don't think we can put any specific number of days to it. I think what we want to come away with from all of this is the sense that this very powerful real estate that we have behind our forehead, our prefrontal cortex, is indeed the way in which that we can embark this behavioral change, both the unlearning, the letting go, and the learning, the adoption of new thoughts and behaviors. And that the amount of specificity and detail that we put on those behaviors and the process that we're engaged in, really acknowledging the often high degree of limbic friction, as I called it, that this requires, is actually a lever to be able to perform these things better. Because what you're also exercising, and this is the beauty of it, the kind of bonus in all of this, is that the very circuits that are involved in limiting certain behaviors in a conscious way and activating certain behaviors in a conscious way, those circuits too are subject to neuroplasticity. So you get better at unlearning, so-called letting go in today's context, and at learning and adopting new behaviors. So you're creating change, and that's very specific around certain unlearnings and new learnings, but you're also creating change around the circuits that act as levers. It's almost like by hitting nails into a section of wood, you're accomplishing something. The nails are going in, but you're also, in doing that, you're making the hammer more effective. And that's really what's cool about the nervous system compared to other organs. It's not just a tool to embark change. It's a tool to embark change that can get better at changing.
Very cool. All right. That wasn't pithy, but that was great.
That for me was
okay. I thank you all for hanging on for a few extra minutes, 2 more minutes, and then I promise we'll be done. Andrew, you said this, you mentioned this Hindu prayer that you had come across a while back that sometimes you revisit because you think there's a lot of wisdom in it, called the Asatoma. And this is, I think this is a loose translation of it, but I'll read it, and then I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, and then I'll share my thoughts on it because I think it directly relates to a lot of what we're talking about today, and then we'll be done. So the Asatoma: lead me from the unreal to the real, lead me from the darkness to light, lead me from time-bound consciousness to timeless state of being. Now, this isn't a religious Basecamp, but I think there's a lot of wisdom here, and I'd love for you to share that with us, Andrew. What do you take from this?
Yeah, I discovered this where it was handed to me about, I guess about 7-8 years ago. It's had a tremendous influence on me and a number of other people. So line by line, I mean, this notion of the unreal to the real, I mean, our thought patterns are often reflective of reality, and they're often not reflective of reality. And this goes in both directions. Sometimes we imagine things to be much worse than they are, sometimes much better than they are. And there's this incredible power that now there's neurobiology that speaks to this around like just absolute truth-telling to oneself. Anna Lemke, who wrote the book Dopamine Nation, amazing book, and who's a colleague of mine at Stanford, talked about this on the podcast with me, that there's actually a strengthening of these prefrontal circuitries when we truth tell both to others and to ourselves. And so this notion of like going from the unreal to the real is about that. It's about not deluding ourselves in one direction or another, and something very easy to do. The second line, leading me from darkness to light, I think relates to that. It's sort of an outgrowth of the first line, which is really about that when we construct a series of behaviors, either moving toward or away from things or both, that are grounded in unreal versus real, pretty soon we find ourselves off course, and then we find ourselves almost like in a kind of diluted state or a darkness around not really knowing what's real or unreal. It starts to actually our perceptions start to become unreliable sources of information. And then the final line, which is a little bit more abstract, but I think has tremendous power, is leading from time-bound consciousness to timeless state of being. And this one is a little trickier because from time-bound consciousness through the lens of neurobiology is, one of the incredible capacities that we have as humans is that we can place our thinking into the future, the past, or the present, or sometimes simultaneously in 2 or even 3 of those, although 3 is tough. This is incredible, right? You can deliberately think about the past. You can deliberately think about the future. You can deliberately think about the present. That's an immense superpower, but it's also a problem. It's a problem because when we become time-bound, for instance, if we see the particular interaction that we are in as the total time bin in which we are making decisions, we're not placing it into a larger context of past, present, and future, we can often make less than optimal decisions, right? So the timelessness that, at least as I interpret it, to time, from time-bound to timelessness, timeless consciousness is really about being able to evaluate our thoughts and actions in a much larger time bin, right? And in that sense, our consciousness is no longer time-bound to whatever state we happen to be in at the moment. It's a higher order function, as we'd say in neuroscience. It requires a lot of top-down processing. It requires reflective processing. And it's something that we can do. And I realize that every line in this, I'm sure, shows up in another prayer, another meditation, another teaching. So these are, which just speaks to the universal nature of these particular lines. But I found the Asatoma to be an incredibly strong anchor for me in thinking about this dynamic ability that we have to anchor to particular time bins and make decisions in particular time bins, but not get locked to those particular time bins. You're not tethered to the now. Being present, we all hear how wonderful it is to be present, but there is actually a time in which you want to be in touch with what you're doing and feeling in the present, but be able to extend out the ramifications of that in both past and future. And that's the seat of our higher consciousness, right? We don't have to have a discussion about what consciousness is. We'll never come to an answer. No one else can. Why would we be able to do that? And it's not really important. What we're really talking about is our capacity to place our thinking and our action into a larger context of time. I think there's tremendous power there if it's done in accordance with reality as you happen to know it.
Amazing, amazing. My simple interpretation of that, the Asatoma, is 1, face the truth, 2, pursue the good, and 3, make the journey the destination. So as you think about what we talked about today, and as you go into the new year, don't be afraid to look back to see what things you want to let go of. Don't be afraid to grab hold of what you want to move towards that's going to bring the good out of you and the world around you. And don't be afraid to live today as you would want to live once you've achieved everything. So find the rewards in the journey, and the destination will take care of itself. I'm so grateful for you all taking time today to be here with us. And thank you for the work you do to, again, bring out the best in yourself and the world around you. Andrew, as always, a pleasure. I got some studying to do. This was awesome, but I wish you all the best. Have a happy holidays, have a happy end of year, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.
Great. Thanks all. Have a great new year.